My name is Tim Carter. I pastor Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. This is the KOINE.org, the apologetic and outreach ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. We're honored to be entrusted the gospel, the teachings of Christ, the doctrines, as some people have an aversion for that word, and I certainly can understand where they might be in their maturation process, being so immature and averse to what the Bible teaches. But we find it impossible to say you love the Bible but then have no interest in what it teaches. So today's lesson's on communion. I'd like to speak to the content of communion. Often we hear categorical expressions like closed communion, close communion, and then of course open communion. And you can hear in those categories different degrees of involvement or commitment, but it really doesn't answer the question. Older pastors once talked about restrictive, meaning there was implication to participation, such as a church in a particular place, which there is such a thing, so there's no reason to listen to people who want to compete with one of the Lord's churches with a concept. There's a conceptual idea of church, but then there's an actual church in the New Testament, as here in Jacksonville, Arkansas, 2200 Marshall Road, Jacksonville, Arkansas, where we, the Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, fully gather together, which is what the word assembly means in the book of Hebrews. In the English text, we don't forsake the assembling, that is the full purpose for gathering together. And the fact that there's something presupposing that function, that's the called out of him in this particular place, who have this connection. And that connection is what we call covenanted together. It's probably more like the word agreement. And people that are of that character and quality of commitment, we participate as the church here in Jacksonville, Arkansas, in a communion service. And our communion service actually achieves something. It's, for example, where communion means fellowship. Our fellowship, according to the Bible, is into the gospel. That's in the first chapter of Philippians, where Paul spoke of that. And that's a good work that God will be faithful to continue until the day of Christ, the last day. So what's achieved? Well, in baptism, which today a lot of people will argue about the amount of water. That's quite the depth to which they can speak. But when the profession of faith is conferred upon someone, the Bible admonishes us to hold fast to that profession of faith. It's a profession of faith that goes all the way back 2,000 years in Christianity. It's a very profound statement to say you are someone who has professed. It makes us professional Christians, as some people call themselves confessional Christians. We hold fast to that profession that is literally conferred through baptism. Now that's by a church. For example, Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, and all the rights and privileges appertaining thereunto have been entrusted the great privilege of giving someone this profession and conferring it upon them in baptism. And yet we admonish them to hold fast. So communion, our fellowship into the gospel, we commemorate that in a communion service. And of course, it can't be commemorative. That is, it can't be something we commemorate unless there's content to it. So the Bible tells us to be transformed by the renovation of our minds. Well, our communion services is when we memorialize Christ and remember him. That's a function of the mind, action of our minds. We who remember him also include his teachings. We can include his way of life, what he did, everything he said, taught, and did. We don't minimize that. Well, then, as those whose relationship is qualified by the teachings of Jesus, as the Bible says, God's love is to keep his commandments, referring to Jesus' teachings, his commandments, so that in relationship to one another, that's the highest expression of love, because it's defined by God, who is love. So we have experienced people who want to love as long as they can define the word. So communion as a service in our church, by this church, includes all that Jesus said, did, and taught. So in that sense, it achieves facilitates the transformation through the renovation of our minds. Our child training that the book of our covenant, the book of Hebrews mentions, that occurs in this body, and we're committed to that process of coming alongside and raising each other up from a childish position, a babe, all the way up to a mastery of the house and occupy the son place that's there to be occupied, similar to the prodigal who went from the pig pen to the father's house, went from being irresponsible, immature, and a squanderer of resources to the steward of them, which is the aspiration of every father, of every son, in the context of the New Testament in the blood of Christ. So it's transformative in the sense that it is that which causes us to recall the admonition to have our minds renovated, and we do that. That's mental, remember, which is, it triggers us to mind after that message, self-examination, not to be sin-centered but Christ-centered, to make certain that our covenantal communion service is a reminder that we're here for the interests of each other, the brothers in the covenant. Here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, the highest level of relationship. We're here to assure that everything we've done can help another brother become the best father, if he's a father, the best husband, if he's a husband, and the best brother in the covenant as God intends that, and only through His church does He achieve that. So with the renovation of our minds, our communion service commemorates that desire for transformation. Maturation, grow up to the full measure of the stature of Christ. That is what we recall, to which we aspire. Moving on unto completion, that perfection is, I believe, the English word. It's completion, maturity, that our New Covenant, book of the New Covenant, book of Hebrews admonishes us to do. So I can understand why there's so much out there that's so empty in what we would call lack of emotional intelligence, where people are underdeveloped. Ours is developmental. Our fellowship is a developmental fellowship into the gospel, where we become conformed to the image of Christ, literally fashioned more and more like Him. As those who have been sanctified and are always being sanctified, we come together. And so in our service itself, why there's probably banter over the distribution is because that's something that was late in church history, where multiple thimbles and multiple bread fragments were then distributed. What we are doing here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, 2200 Marshall Road, Jacksonville, Arkansas, heads of the households, future heads of the households, brothers in the covenant, each of us come and take of the fruit of the vine in the, I call it thimbles, but it's a miniature cup, and each of us take bread fragments, and for example, we distribute it among each of our families. Then those that are there without heads of households, arrangements are made before the service, and just as when we retrieve and take and receive the cup and the bread fragment, that's all done before the service starts. We have a Sunday school class where different classes meet and study the Bible. Well, when those classes dismiss, and as others are arriving who come for the worship service, corporate worship service, the morning worship service, they already have those elements collected, and they've already, all that's out of the way, so that when I stand before the congregation, and each time I take a lesson and remind the congregation, and also encourage us, and we're always relieved to know that God doesn't condemn us for forgetting, rather He encourages us to remember. And remembering Jesus has implication. And I've even told them about two sons. One, when he recalls his father, he begins to cry and he's very emotional. The other, when he recalls and remembers his father, he's very devotional. That is, highly devoted, faithful to his father's instructions. He's grown upwardly. The one who might be very emotional, as in one account I literally gave, he breaks the laws. He's not a father to his children. He's not a husband to his wife. He's not a brother in the covenant. But when you ask him about recall, it's emotional. Well, for us, it's transformational. It's corrective. Again, it centers us on Christ, not on sin. But the big question is why there's debate about, some say, well, then we want to co-extend this to someone that's at least baptized. Well, it really doesn't achieve what only the participation in that church will do. It seems that what occurs in a church is now what people are wanting to tell people they do. The dazzling preacher, the iconic figure who wants people to follow him, he wants to say transformation. He wants to talk about interrelational development, but that's only what Christ does for us as we in his body, the church in a particular place, covenant together, the highest order of fellowship. So if the communion is only a category closed, that could make sense why people would so negatively connotate it. And I'll conclude a billboard I noticed once in south from here, but it had this billboard and it said, if you believe in Jesus, then you're welcome to commune with us. Well, what the reader of the billboard who would fall for something so silly might think is, may not notice, is that us. Us is a personal pronoun, has an antecedent that demarcates a particular group there in a particular capacity according to a particular relationship. And instead of them growing in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, instead of them growing in a maturative process and commemorating that through memorializing the body and broken body and shed blood of Christ, which is to recall him not just emotionally, but to recall him intellectually, mentally, mind after his teachings, walk in his path, live in relationship to one another. They're in that covenant relationship. They won't even notice that there's a particular us there. They don't even notice the us and them language of that billboard. So people want to tout themselves as being more correct because they're open, others more correct because they're close, and others still close. But what is the content of that? Because restrictive pastors who admonish people, like here at Landmark Baptist Church, if a man's not faithful to his wife, he needs to work things out with her and see that marriage reconciled. If she's not faithful to her husband, they need to work that out, and we need to get that fixed. Don't come here thinking that because you, in presence of other people, reached out and took a cup and consumed a bread fragment, that you're doing anything the Bible speaks of. You're commemorating nothing of Christ. It's not covenantal, and you're not living for the interest of your own spouse. Children who are rebellious against their parents, disobedient to authorities, they aren't faithful in the church, they aren't good students in the church, they aren't growing upwardly in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that would be an open, nullified fellowship, should they just simply think because they can reach out their hand as, quote, a member. Our membership at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church is dependent upon fellowship, which is holding all things in common, which is dependent upon the profession of faith conferred through baptism, which is interdependent upon were you regenerated through the gospel. As one who's regenerated, fathered, and always being fathered, you come forward outwardly professing that faith. Our baptism is about that gospel. We're fathered through the gospel. Our baptism is about the gospel. Our communion's into the gospel, and our commission is to take the gospel. We were commissional before it was cool. And now everybody wants to say they're commissional. Well, we've only been that way for 2,000 years. So when it comes to communion, if there's no substantive engagement with the realities of improving and developing and maturing and correction and transformation and the covenant and living with the interests of others. I had to ask a man once, he was trying to talk to me about open communion in our church because he, somewhere over the span of time, he had found someone who had taken a bread fragment and a cup that he knew wasn't a member. Well, at the time he was admonishing me, confronting me, and whatever he wanted to call it, he was in transition of leaving his wife, abandoning his children, and dishonoring the covenant in relationship to marriage. So I don't know how a person gets divorced that observes communion according to the Bible. The fellowship that's into the gospel is transformative. It's instructional, it's developmental. Like I said, I can go through this all day, but what we do in the actual service is to commemorate and memorialize Christ by glorifying him for the implication of his death and his willingness to have his body broken and his blood shed. And we glorify him by demonstrating the quantifiable, demonstrable differences that are made by his life. Jesus did not die in vain, and we don't commune in vain. nor do we commemorate our fellowship into the gospel in vain by just simply having some trite expression. So if you say closed communion, which we're accused, people are saying we're that, but it's because they can't say anything better. They lack the maturation, they lack the character to admire, to exhort, to, how would we say it, encourage people. Because if you come into one of the Lord's churches and there aren't strong people grown up to the full measure of the stature, if there aren't people who have gone from the childish state to the full-grown son position, if there aren't people who are strong in the Lord, who can teach and show you the well-worn path, on what path are you walking, and then why would you want to be among people that just say, well, we don't have it figured out, we're just kind of aimlessly walking around. Well, if you're aimlessly walking around, Jesus called that the broad way that leads to destruction. There's many there that find it. Your life won't end in self-destruction by fully engaging in a New Testament church, in a particular place, according to the highest level of commitment. So that's the highest ordered fellowship there is. The expression of it could be no greater than following the teachings of Jesus. And I'm honored that our communion is into the gospel, and that our communion is covenantal, and that we are accused of closed. That's an honor to be so categorized. And yet I can certainly understand why people could be so immature and so remotely related to Christ and have so little regard for Him that they'll take a service that's designed to memorialize Him, that should be something we finds us in awe and reverence. They can take it and use it as a ploy. They can use it to diminish one group, to elevate another, distinguish themselves, which is the opposite purpose for which the memorial service is even held. So you have a blessed day, and may God bless